The brave men and women who risked their lives.
They saw that there was a job that needed to be done. They wanted to serve Canada.
The families who will never stop missing them.
Remembrance Days every day for us.
Tonight on The Source, we remember. Today is Remembrance Day. Canadians have paid a disproportionate price in the wars for Western liberty. We joined both the First and Second World Wars years before our American cousins did, and in very high numbers. It's even more remarkable in that those wars and the war in Korea and the dozens of military missions over the decades, none of them were to defend our own soil. They were to defend our friends and allies and the very idea of freedom and democracy. It's one of the reasons Canada is so well loved around the world, and it's one of the reasons why we should have such pride in our troops and our veterans. Remembrance is one day where everyone remembers, even just for a minute or two. This year, Canadians are more passionately devoted to Remembrance Day, given the terrorist murder of 2 Canadian forces just last month. Warrant Officer Patrice Vincent, who was killed by a terrorist using a car as a weapon, and Corporal Nathan Cirillo, who was standing on guard at the National War Memorial when a Muslim terrorist walked right up to him and shot him dead, and then proceeded to attack Parliament itself. Both deaths were awful, but the murder of Corporal Cirillo was especially symbolic. He was standing guard over the memory of other soldiers who had died protecting freedom. And for that symbolic act, he was murdered. It was a Muslim terrorist symbol, too. That terrorist could have killed many more people just shooting at random tourists, but he murdered Corporal Cirillo to make a point. By showing up in such force today at Remembrance Day ceremonies across Canada, and by buying so many poppies, Canadians have sent a counterpoint that we will not be terrorized into submission. You, my dear viewers, also sent a powerful message. Last month, we set up a crowdfunding website to raise $100,000 for the families of the 2 deceased soldiers. In literally 7 days, we raised the funds. This morning, I was delighted to cut 2 checks in equal measure for $50,000 each to trust funds set up by the regiments for these 2 families. Thank you for your generosity. You'll recall when I set up that fundraising campaign, I mentioned that the first $100,000 would go to the 2 families, and that if we raised any more than that, that money would go to other families whose loved ones died in the line of duty. I'll tell you later in the show what I'm going to do with the surplus funds. I hope you'll approve. Today is a grave day, a day where I suspect many of us feel inadequate. How do we properly thank people, strangers really, who make the ultimate sacrifice for us, who willingly put themselves at such risk? If someone says they're willing to die for you and you don't even know them, how do you thank them? I'm not just talking about the ones who do die, but the ones also who are wounded, and those who aren't, but who knowingly and willingly risk everything to serve us simply because we are Canadians together. Words are insufficient, but that's all we have, I think, words and remembering soldiers and their families the other 364 days a year, not just on Remembrance Day. I'd like to read you a short poem about that, written more than 100 years ago by the great conservative poet, Rudyard Kipling, in my mind one of the best poets besides Shakespeare himself. Here's Kipling's poem called Tommy. Tommy Atkins being the British nickname for any soldier, sort of like saying G.I. Joe. Here's the poem called Tommy. I went into a public house to get a pint of beer. The publican, he up and says, we serve no redcoats here. The girls behind the bar, they laughed and giggled fit to die. I outs into the street again, and to myself says I, oh, it's Tommy this and Tommy that and Tommy go away. But it's thank you, Mr. Atkins, when the band begins to play. The band begins to play, my boys. The band begins to play. Oh, it's thank you, Mr. Atkins, when the band begins to play. I went into a theater as sober as could be. They gave a drunk civilian room, but hadn't none for me. They sent me to the gallery or around the music halls. But when it comes to fighting, Lord, they'll shove me in the stalls. For it's Tommy this and Tommy that and Tommy wait outside. But it's special train for Atkins. When the trooper's on the tide, the troop ship's on the tide, my boys. The troop ship's on the tide. Oh, it's special train for Atkins. When the trooper's on the tide. Yes, making mock-a uniforms that guard you while you sleep is cheaper than them uniforms, and they're starvation cheap. And hustling drunken soldiers when they're going large a bit is 5 times better business than parading in full kit. Then it's Tommy this and Tommy that and Tommy, how's your soul? But it's thin red line of heroes when the drums begin to roll. The drums begin to roll, my boys. The drums begin to roll. Oh, it's thin red line of heroes when the drums begin to roll. We aren't no thin red heroes, nor we aren't no blackguards too. but single men in barracks most remarkable like you. And if sometimes our conduct isn't all your fancy paints, why single men in barracks don't grow into plaster saints. While it's Tommy this and Tommy that and Tommy fall behind, but it's pleased to walk in front, sir, when there's trouble in the wind. There's trouble in the wind, my boys, there's trouble in the wind. Oh, it's pleased to walk in front, sir, when there's trouble in the wind. You talk of better food for us and schools and fires and all. We'll wait for extra rations if you treat us rational. Don't mess about the cookroom slops, but prove it to our face. The widow's uniform is not the soldier man's disgrace, for it's Tommy this and Tommy that and chuck him out the brute, but it's savior of his country when the guns begin to shoot. And it's Tommy this and Tommy that and anything you please. And Tommy ain't a bloomin' fool. You bet that Tommy sees. Don't you think we do that? We treat our soldiers and veterans with great respect once a year or when we're in desperate trouble, but the rest of the time we ignore them at best and oftentimes despise them. How about even today? Even today, the front page of the Ottawa Citizen newspaper, the so-called newspaper of record in our capital city, runs a front page banner headline, "First week of war in Iraq has cost Canada millions." Seriously, that's their biggest, most important story on this, our Remembrance Day. A Remembrance Day, short weeks after a soldier was murdered in Ottawa for remembering. That's the story. That a war that we are waging against terrorists in concert with allies, with six CF-18 jets and refueling planes and reconnaissance planes, and 600 Canadian forces in support, that has cost millions of dollars. What did they think it would cost? Thousands? Or maybe hundreds? Do they think that's too much money? Or is it just a way to plant more seeds of doubt and resentment against our troops? Should we support them less? Should we have cheaper equipment? What exactly is the Ottawa Citizen saying here? That we're spending too much? Or that the mission's inappropriate? Or that's the most important thing to grouse about on this day of remembrance? But this disgraceful front page insult is no surprise, coming from the Ottawa Citizen, literally on the same day that Corporal Nathan Cirillo was buried, the soldier murdered in Ottawa by terrorists, literally on that dark day, that very day he was buried. The Ottawa Citizen chose to run a guest editorial by Omar Khadr, a convicted, confessed, unrepentant terrorist who murdered another soldier, an American soldier named Christopher Speer. Put aside that Khadr's editorial was full of factual lies, that it called for us to put down our guard and water down our national security. That's what terrorists say, no surprise there. But what about the editors of the leading newspaper in our capital city? Disgracing themselves on Corporal Nathan Cirillo's funeral day, disgracing themselves again today on Remembrance Day, no different than yesterday's news about the Windsor, Ontario School Board exemption of students from Remembrance Day ceremonies. So yeah, Tommy Atkins, Kipling's warning 100 years ago, is still true today. Well, I told you earlier that we raised a bit more than $100,000 that we were aiming for the two families. So I'm sending out the two $50,000 checks. But if you recall, I said we would use any surplus to set up a fund for other families of fallen soldiers too. I was going to simply hand over those checks to some pre-existing charities that do that sort of work. But when I was reviewing the financial statements of a few of those charities that they filed with Revenue Canada, I was disappointed to see how much those charities themselves take for fundraising commissions or professional fees for their overhead. I don't want to name names. Those charities still do some good work, but I was disappointed to see up to 40% of their revenues were consumed by overhead. So here's what I've done. I put together a team of professionals who've agreed to either do the work for free or donate back the cost of their services back to the charity. I've personally donated the cost of the website. A leading charity lawyer in Ottawa, Adam Aptowitzer, has agreed to do the legal incorporation for free. An outstanding accountant in Toronto, Ryan Knight, has generously agreed to do the accounting. Two Canadian Forces veterans have agreed to sit on the board. Marcus Sturzer, who served in Afghanistan, and Brian McDonald, who served in Bosnia. I want to make this my go-to charity 365 days a year, not just once a year on Remembrance Day. I want to make it my default charity because I'll know exactly what it'll go to. I'll know that we'll keep the expenses as close to zero as possible, thanks to the generous help of professional services. We're setting up the incorporation now. I don't have the CRA charity number yet, but I'll let you know as soon as I do. I'm very excited about this. It's a pure charity with very low expenses, completely focused on our soldiers' families. That's where I'm going to put the surplus from last year's fundraising. The amount we raised was over $100,000. And directly into this charity, I'm going to start with $14,065. That's the surplus from what we raised last month. The charity's website will be the same one we used for last month's campaign, www.proudcanada.ca, if you want to make this your go-to charity. Also, just sign up on the website now. The minute we're registered as an official CRA charity and we can start issuing charitable tax receipts, I'll send you an email so you know. So if you put your email on the website now, I will contact you when we have our charitable status. I'm grateful to our soldiers and veterans and their families. I'm sad at the loss of so many good people. I rage against our enemies, both foreign and domestic. I despise those in the media and politics who take the side of our enemies instead of our own country. But with this project, with the generous help from my lawyer and accounting friends and with the guidance of my veteran friends, I think I can do something positive, and I want you to join me. Go to proudcanada.ca and put your name on the list. And the moment we get our CRA charity number, I'll email that to you and let you know. And I hope our charity will be there for the troops in a very small proportion of the way they're always there for us.